In the late 13th century, the land of Anatolia, today known mostly as Turkey, was a patchwork of small states, restless warriors, and fading empires. The once mighty Seljuk Empire, which had ruled over large parts of the region, was collapsing under the pressure of Mongol invasions and internal fighting. Its central control had all but disappeared, leaving behind a landscape filled with opportunity for ambitious men. One such man was Osman. Osman was not born into the kind of royalty you read about in fairy tales. He wasn't raised in a golden palace or surrounded by silk curtains and polished floors. He was the son of Ertugrul, a tribal leader of the Kaya clan, a small group of nomadic Turks who had moved westward to escape the Mongols. They weren't looking to build an empire at first. They were simply trying to survive. The Kaya tribe had settled in a town called Surgut, near the Byzantine frontier. This was a tricky place to be. On one side were the crumbling remains of the Byzantine Empire. On the other were rival Turkish beyliks, little principalities that were often fighting each other. Life in this part of the world was uncertain, and power shifted constantly. But Osman had something special: charisma, vision, and perhaps most importantly, timing. He began his rise not with armies and battles but with relationships. He married the daughter of a powerful sheikh, which gave him both religious support and political backing. He started winning the trust of his fellow tribesmen, who began to see him not just as the son of a leader, but as a leader in his own right. The world around him was changing fast. The Byzantines were weak and distracted. Other Turkish rulers were preoccupied with their own small feuds. Osman saw an opportunity and he took it. According to legend, Osman had a dream. In this dream he saw a great tree growing from his chest, its branches stretching across the land, shading rivers, mountains, and cities. Some say this dream was a sign from God, a prophecy that his descendants would rule a vast empire. Whether that dream actually happened or not, Osman acted like it did. He began attacking nearby Byzantine outposts, not with massive armies but with quick raids and clever tactics. He gained a reputation as a fearless and cunning leader. His warriors, Ghazis or holy warriors, believed they were fighting a just and sacred battle against a declining Christian power. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about purpose. Osman's forces were not large, but they were passionate. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He didn't build his state overnight. It was more like stitching together a quilt patch by patch, piece by piece. One of his first major targets was a town called Bilecik. Osman knew the town was important and well defended, so he didn't march in with swords blazing. Instead, he used a bit of trickery. According to the stories, Osman and his men disguised themselves as guests arriving for a wedding. They entered the town peacefully, waited until the right moment, and then overpowered the guards and took control. This clever style of warfare using surprise and intelligence became one of Osman's trademarks. It allowed him to punch above his weight. As he captured more towns, Osman began to build a government. He appointed trusted men to govern the new lands. He encouraged trade and protected merchants. He didn't just conquer, he built. He also welcomed people of different backgrounds into his growing domain. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all lived under his rule, and many found his leadership more stable than the chaos around them. This inclusive approach helped Osman's state grow faster and with less resistance. By the early 1300s, Osman controlled a decent-sized region in northwest Anatolia. He declared independence from the Seljuks, who were barely holding themselves together at that point. In 1299, Osman officially founded his own state. It wasn't yet called the Ottoman Empire, but that seed had now been planted. The name Ottoman comes from Osman's own name, which was pronounced Uthman in Arabic. Over time, the people of the region began to call themselves Osmanliler, Osman's people. In English, that eventually became Ottomans. As Osman's power grew, so did the threats around him. Rival beyliks began to notice him. The Byzantines, though weakened, weren't going to sit quietly while their towns were taken. But Osman had built something stronger than an army. He had built a loyal following. His warriors believed in his mission. His subjects, many of whom had once feared being conquered, now saw Osman as a source of order and protection. Even his enemies respected his ambition. Toward the end of his life, Osman set his sights on the city of Bursa, a wealthy and important stronghold in the region. It wasn't easy to take. Bursa was fortified and well supplied, but Osman began the siege and laid the foundation for its eventual capture. By then Osman was old and ill. He wouldn't live to see Bursa fall, but he had started something irreversible. His son Orhan would continue where he left off. In 1326, the same year Osman died, Orhan finally took Bursa. It became the Ottomans' first true capital, and from there the empire began to blossom. Osman's death marked the end of one chapter and the start of another. He was buried in Bursa, and his tomb remains there to this day. Pilgrims still visit, leaving prayers and offerings to the man who turned a small tribe into the foundation of one of history's greatest empires. Looking back, it's hard not to be amazed by what Osman achieved. He didn't have huge armies or vast wealth. He didn't inherit a kingdom. What he had was clarity. He saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He turned a dream into something real. Osman's story is the story of beginnings of risk, belief, and bold moves. He could never have guessed just how far his descendants would go. But in every future Ottoman sultan there was a little bit of Osman. His name lived on not just in titles and coins, but in the rhythm of history. His dream became a dynasty, and his people, nomads who once wandered the steppes, became rulers of cities, empires, and centuries. And so from the dusty roads of Surgut a legend began to walk, not with noise and fanfare, but with quiet determination and steady step. The world didn't notice at first, but soon it would. This was only the beginning. After Osman's death, the legacy he left behind was one of ambition, hope, and opportunity. His son, Orhan, inherited a small but steadily growing state in the midst of an unstable world. Osman's dream wasn't just about territorial conquest or military might. It was about something much deeper, the creation of a new power in a land filled with chaos. Orhan had been groomed for leadership from a young age. He was ready to continue his father's work, and he did so with the same careful balance of military conquest and diplomacy that had made Osman so successful. Orhan's reign would be marked by one key achievement: the transition from a small tribal kingdom into a real functioning state. In 1326, shortly after Osman's death, Orhan led the Ottomans to a critical victory, the capture of Bursa, the first truly significant city for the Ottomans. Bursa was a prosperous town, rich in agriculture and trade, and it sat right at the crossroads of Asia and Europe. Its location made it a jewel that every local power would have wanted. But Orhan was not a man to shy away from such a challenge. The capture of Bursa marked a turning point. No longer were the Ottomans simply a wandering tribe living off the fringes of a crumbling empire. They now held a well-established urban center. Orhan understood that if he was to build something lasting, he needed more than just land. He needed legitimacy. Orhan sought out recognition from the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, who was still nominally the ruler of Anatolia at the time. By securing the Sultan's blessing, Orhan reinforced his position as a legitimate ruler in the eyes of other Turkish beyliks, as well as the Christian powers to the west. This was a clever diplomatic move, one that would pay dividends in the years to come. But Orhan was not only concerned with diplomacy. He knew that the Ottomans needed a strong military to back up their political ambitions. He focused on expanding his army and building alliances with local Turkish tribes. These alliances brought both warriors and resources into the Ottoman fold. Orhan's greatest military victory came in 1331, when he launched a campaign against the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, already weakened by internal strife, were unable to put up much resistance. Orhan captured the important town of Nicomedia, strategically located on the edge of the Sea of Marmara. This victory allowed the Ottomans to control a crucial part of the Byzantine Empire's territory. Nicomedia would become a key military base for the Ottomans as they began their conquest of the entire region. As the Ottomans expanded, they also began to build the foundations of a state. Orhan set up a centralized government system that included a military bureaucracy, tax collection, and legal structures. But he also took a more hands-on approach to governance. He encouraged merchants to settle in his cities, making Bursa a vital economic hub. Orhan also continued his father's policy of welcoming people of various backgrounds, Christians, Jews, and Muslims into his territories. In addition to military and political strategies, Orhan was deeply influenced by the Islamic faith. As the leader of a Muslim state, he sought to establish a strong relationship with the religious scholars of the time. He was known for his piety and for making sure that his military campaigns were seen as part of a larger religious mission. The idea of Ghazis, warriors fighting for Islam, became central to the Ottoman identity, and Orhan played a key role in shaping that ideology. By the time Orhan passed away in 1362, the Ottoman state had already grown significantly. His son Murad I ascended to the throne, and the world was about to witness a new chapter in the rise of the Ottomans. Murad I took the reins during a period of intense political and military challenges. Europe was growing in power, and the Ottomans found themselves up against formidable opponents. But Murad was a determined and capable leader who understood that the road to power required boldness. Under Murad's leadership, the Ottomans continued their conquest of the Byzantine Empire, but their sights also turned to the European Balkans. The Ottoman strategy was changing, no longer just a matter of picking off small defenseless towns. The Ottomans were now aiming for full-scale control of a region. They had the military strength, the strategic location, and the vision to make it happen. In 1363, Murad secured a crucial victory at the Battle of Adrianople. This battle was a major turning point. It gave the Ottomans control over a large portion of the Balkans, and it placed them in direct conflict with the European powers to the west. The victory at Adrianople also marked a shift in the nature of Ottoman power. No longer were the Ottomans just a group of nomadic tribes. They were now a real established empire, with a strong foothold in Europe. But Murad's expansion into the Balkans was not without its challenges. The European powers, particularly the Kingdom of Hungary and the Serbian Empire, were not going to stand by and watch the Ottomans grow uncontested. Over the next decades, Murad would fight several bloody campaigns to secure his empire's borders. One of the most famous conflicts during this time was the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. The battle was fought between Murad's forces and the combined armies of Serbia and their allies. It was a brutal and decisive engagement, and while the outcome was inconclusive, both sides suffered heavy casualties. It solidified the Ottomans as the dominant force in the Balkans. After the battle, Murad was assassinated by a Serbian nobleman, and his death shocked the empire. Murad's son Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt, would take over the empire after his father's death. Bayezid quickly demonstrated that he was more than capable of continuing the work his father had begun. He solidified Ottoman control over the Balkans, expanded into Anatolia, and even launched campaigns into Hungary. But just as the Ottomans seemed to be on the brink of greatness, disaster struck. In 1402, Bayezid faced one of the most significant defeats in Ottoman history. A powerful Mongol leader named Timur, or Tamerlane, came out of Central Asia and smashed the Ottoman forces at the Battle of Ankara. The Ottomans were not prepared for Timur's brutal tactics. Bayezid was captured and held in captivity until his death, and the empire was thrown into chaos. The capture of Bayezid and the defeat at Ankara marked a dramatic setback for the Ottomans. The empire, which had seemed invincible just a few years before, now found itself fragmented and vulnerable. But the story of the Ottomans was far from over. After Bayezid's death, his sons fought each other for control of the empire. This period, known as the Ottoman interregnum, lasted for several years. It was a time of weakness and confusion, but also a time when the resilience of the Ottoman people would prove itself once again. Eventually, one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, emerged victorious and reunified the empire. The Ottoman Empire was on the rise once again, and the next chapter of its journey would be even more extraordinary. After the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, the Ottoman Empire faced its darkest hour. The empire, once on the rise, was now fragmented and in disarray. The brutal capture of Bayezid Desert by Timur, the Mongol conqueror, threw the Ottomans into a period of internal conflict and instability. Bayezid's sons fought amongst themselves for control of the throne, and for years the empire was in turmoil, a shadow of the power it once was. This chaotic period, known as the Ottoman interregnum, lasted from 1402 to 1413, with the empire teetering on the brink of collapse. But the Ottomans, like their founder Osman, were a people who refused to give up easily. Amidst this turmoil, one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed II, emerged as a strong and capable leader. Mehmed was determined to reunite the empire and restore it to its former glory. His journey to power was not easy, but he was driven by a singular vision: to strengthen the Ottoman state and ensure its survival. Mehmed II's path to the throne was marked by struggles and battles. After the defeat of his father, the empire was divided into separate territories, with each of Bayezid's sons claiming a portion of the realm. It was a period of brutal civil war, with alliances shifting constantly, and the stakes could not have been higher. But Mehmed, with his tactical brilliance and determination, managed to win over key allies and defeat his brothers one by one. By 1413, after a series of bloody confrontations, he emerged victorious and claimed the Ottoman throne. With Mehmed II firmly in power, the empire began to heal. He worked tirelessly to restore order, rebuild the Ottoman military, and re-establish the administrative system that had been so effective under his father. Mehmed II's reign, though relatively short, set the stage for the empire's resurgence. He understood that the empire's survival depended on strong central control and a unified front, so he focused on consolidating power and securing the empire's borders. He rebuilt key cities, fortified defenses, and began to restore the unity that had been shattered by the interregnum. But it was Mehmed II's successor, Murad II, who would take the Ottoman Empire to new heights. Murad II, like his father, was a determined leader, but his reign was marked by even greater challenges. The Ottomans faced external threats from powerful European kingdoms and the ever-present Byzantine Empire, which still clung to its ancient territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. Yet despite these threats, Murad II was able to expand the Ottoman Empire and secure its position as the dominant power in the region. Murad II's first significant military campaign was against the Kingdom of Hungary. The Hungarians, led by King Sigismund, had long been a rival power to the Ottomans in the Balkans, and in 1444, they launched an ambitious crusade against the Ottomans. The crusade, known as the Battle of Varna, was a disastrous defeat for the Europeans. Murad II's forces decisively crushed the Crusaders, and the battle marked a major turning point in the power dynamics of Eastern Europe. This victory secured Ottoman dominance in the Balkans and ensured that the empire would not be easily displaced by its European rivals. Murad II's success on the battlefield was not just about military strategy, it was also about understanding the political landscape of the time. He was a master at forging alliances and utilizing diplomacy to achieve his goals. For example, he managed to secure peace with the powerful Serbian despotate by marrying his daughter to the Serbian ruler, ensuring that the Ottomans would not face another front in the Balkans. Murad's diplomatic efforts were crucial in solidifying the empire's influence and securing its position as the dominant power in the region. While Murad II was busy with military campaigns and diplomacy, another pressing concern arose for the Ottomans: the threat of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, led by Emperor John X Palaeologus, were weakened and struggling to maintain their dwindling territories. The Ottomans had already taken significant chunks of Byzantine territory in Anatolia and the Balkans, but Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, remained firmly under Byzantine control. The city's strategic location made it a crucial prize for any would-be conqueror, and the Ottomans had their sights firmly set on it. By the mid-15th century, it was clear that the fall of Constantinople was inevitable, and it would be the young Sultan Mehmed II, the son of Murad II, who would claim that prize. Mehmed II, also known as the Conqueror, was determined to make his mark on history. From the moment he ascended to the throne in 1444, Mehmed focused all his efforts on capturing Constantinople, a city that had resisted conquest for over 1,000 years. In 1453, after a long and brutal siege, Mehmed II succeeded where many before him had failed. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans after a 53-day siege, and the Byzantine Empire came to a final crushing end. The fall of Constantinople was a turning point not only for the Ottomans, but for the entire world. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. The Ottomans now controlled one of the most important cities in the world, a city that had been a hub of culture, religion, and politics for centuries. The conquest of Constantinople was a remarkable achievement, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Ottomans. The city was renamed Istanbul, and it would become the heart of the Ottoman Empire for centuries to come. Under Mehmed II's leadership, the empire expanded rapidly, and the Ottomans became a true superpower in both Europe and Asia. Mehmed's vision was clear. He wanted to unite the Eastern and Western worlds under Ottoman rule, and he took bold steps to make that happen. Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople was not just a military victory, it was a cultural one as well. After the fall of the city, many Greek scholars fled to the West, bringing with them knowledge of classical antiquity, which would later play a key role in the Renaissance. Mehmed, understanding the importance of education, established a new administration that blended Islamic and Byzantine traditions. He brought in scholars and architects from all over the world to make Istanbul a cultural and intellectual hub. He also opened the city's doors to different faiths, ensuring that the Ottomans remained a diverse empire with religious tolerance at its core. The fall of Constantinople set the stage for the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed II's reign was one of the most remarkable in Ottoman history. His military prowess, diplomatic skill, and cultural vision helped shape the empire into one of the world's greatest powers. But while Mehmed II had succeeded in securing the future of the Ottomans, there were still challenges ahead. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire had established itself as a global power. But its future, like its past, would not be easy. The empire would continue to grow and expand, but it would also face internal divisions, external threats, and the pressure of managing a vast and diverse empire. Yet as long as the Ottomans continued to draw upon the vision and strength of their early leaders, they would remain a formidable force in the world for centuries to come. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Empire entered a new era, one marked by prosperity, cultural flourishing, and military expansion. Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, had succeeded in capturing the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and with it, the most coveted city in the world. But this was only the beginning. The Ottoman Empire would go on to experience one of the most remarkable periods of growth and stability in its history, becoming the dominant power in both the East and the West. This chapter of Ottoman history is known as the Golden Age, and it would set the stage for the empire's long-lasting influence in the world. Following the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II worked tirelessly to rebuild the city, now renamed Istanbul. His vision was to make it the political, cultural, and intellectual center of the world. He brought in scholars, artists, and architects from all over his empire and beyond, including renowned figures from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Mehmed's aim was to combine the intellectual richness of the Greek and Roman traditions with the artistic and architectural innovations of the Islamic world. Under his patronage, Istanbul became a city of incredible beauty, housing magnificent mosques, palaces, and libraries that would rival any city in Europe. Mehmed also understood the importance of controlling trade routes, and Istanbul's strategic position on the Bosporus Strait, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, gave the Ottomans a significant advantage. The empire's control of this vital passage allowed them to dominate trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Merchants from across the globe were drawn to Istanbul, and the city became a thriving hub of commerce and culture. The wealth generated by this trade helped to fund the empire's military campaigns and public works, making the Golden Age not just a time of cultural and intellectual flourishing, but also a period of remarkable economic growth. However, while Mehmed II's reign was one of great success, it was not without its challenges. One of his major concerns was securing the empire's borders and expanding its territories further. Mehmed's ambition for territorial expansion was not just about conquest for the sake of power. He believed that the Ottomans were destined to rule over all of Islam. To achieve this, he turned his attention to the south, where he sought to expand Ottoman influence in the Arab world. Mehmed II's successors, particularly his son Bayezid II, continued to build upon the foundations laid by the conqueror. Bayezid's reign, however, was marked by a shift in focus. While Mehmed II had focused on territorial conquest, Bayezid sought to consolidate the empire's power within its borders. He worked to strengthen the military, improve the administrative system, and maintain stability throughout the vast Ottoman Empire. But it was during the reign of his son Selim I that the Ottomans truly began to exert their dominance over the Islamic world. Selim I, also known as the Grim, was a decisive and ruthless leader. In 1517, he launched a series of military campaigns that would solidify Ottoman control over the heart of the Islamic world. His most significant achievement was the conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled over Egypt and much of the Arabian Peninsula. With the defeat of the Mamluks, the Ottomans took control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, as well as the key trade routes between Asia, Africa, and Europe. This victory not only strengthened the Ottomans' position in the region, but also reinforced their status as the leading power in the Muslim world. The conquest of the Mamluks was a key turning point in Ottoman history, and it marked the beginning of the empire's role as the protector of Islam. Following Selim I's victory in the south, the Ottomans turned their attention to the west. The empire had long had its eyes on Europe, and during the 16th century, it was under the leadership of his son Suleiman the Magnificent that the Ottomans would reach the height of their power in Europe. Suleiman, who reigned from 1520 to 1566, is often considered the greatest of all the Ottoman sultans. He was not only a brilliant military commander, but also a skilled diplomat, a patron of the arts, and a reformer who helped to modernize the empire's legal and administrative systems. Suleiman's military campaigns were expansive and ambitious. He led the Ottomans to victory in a series of wars against the Christian powers of Europe. One of his most notable victories was the capture of Belgrade in 1521, which gave the Ottomans control over a key fortress in the Balkans. The capture of Belgrade opened the path for further Ottoman expansion into Hungary and Central Europe. In 1526, Suleiman's forces dealt a crushing blow to the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs, solidifying Ottoman control over Hungary and marking the peak of Ottoman power in Europe. The Ottomans were now firmly entrenched in Central Europe, and they seemed unstoppable. But Suleiman's conquests were not confined to Europe alone. He also expanded the empire's influence in the Mediterranean, taking control of key territories such as Rhodes and parts of North Africa. The Ottomans became the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean, challenging the Venetians, the Spanish, and other European powers for control of the sea. The Ottomans' naval strength was largely due to the leadership of the Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, whose skillful command of the Ottoman fleet helped to secure Ottoman dominance over the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman's leadership, the Ottoman Empire became a beacon of culture and learning. Suleiman was a patron of the arts and oversaw a cultural renaissance in the empire. The reign of Suleiman saw the construction of some of the most impressive architectural feats in Ottoman history, including the famous Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, designed by the legendary architect Mimar Sinan. Suleiman also reformed the Ottoman legal system, creating a more unified and structured legal code that would become a model for future generations. But despite the empire's outward success, there were signs of trouble within. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to govern such a vast and diverse territory. The military, which had once been the backbone of Ottoman power, began to face challenges as the Sultan's reliance on Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, grew. The Janissaries, once a loyal and highly effective force, became increasingly resistant to reform, and their power grew to such an extent that they began to exert significant influence over the sultans. This shift in the balance of power within the empire would eventually contribute to the decline of the Ottoman military. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to show signs of strain. While the empire continued to be a dominant force in the world, it had begun to experience internal instability and external challenges. The empire's vast size, combined with a series of military defeats and economic difficulties, would set the stage for the challenges that would face future sultans. The golden age of the Ottomans, while lasting for over a century, was slowly coming to an end. Yet even as the empire began to face challenges, it remained one of the most powerful and influential states in the world. The legacy of Suleiman and his successors would endure for centuries, and the Ottoman Empire would continue to shape the political and cultural landscape of both Europe and the Middle East. The golden age of the Ottomans, marked by military expansion, cultural flourishing, and economic growth, would remain one of the most remarkable periods in the history of empires. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached its zenith. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent had secured Ottoman power and influence, both in Europe and the Middle East, but the glory days of the empire were beginning to fade. While the Ottomans were still a dominant force on the global stage, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their once mighty empire. The 17th century would mark the beginning of a slow and steady decline, a process that would take several centuries and profoundly reshape the empire's future. After the death of Suleiman in 1566, the Ottoman Empire found itself without a ruler of comparable skill or vision. His successors, although competent in their own right, lacked the strength and decisiveness that had characterized his reign. The sultans who followed struggled to maintain control over the vast and increasingly diverse empire. While the Ottoman military was still formidable, it was becoming increasingly difficult to govern an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. The internal problems that would come to plague the empire in the centuries to follow began to take root during this period. One of the most immediate challenges the Ottomans faced after Suleiman's death was the growing power of the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had been a key component of the Ottoman military machine. Initially, the Janissaries were an essential and loyal fighting force, but over time, they became more powerful and less willing to follow the Sultan's orders. The Janissaries were no longer the disciplined, professional soldiers they had once been. Instead, they had become a powerful political force within the empire, often making and unmaking sultans at will. The loyalty of the Janissaries began to erode, and their influence in the political and military spheres grew, weakening the central authority of the sultan. Alongside this internal unrest, the empire was beginning to face external pressures that it had never experienced before. The rise of European powers, particularly the Habsburg monarchy and the Russian Empire, posed a significant challenge to Ottoman supremacy. The Habsburgs in particular had long been a rival to the Ottomans, and by the early 17th century they were able to assert their power more effectively. The Ottomans had long controlled much of Eastern and Central Europe, but their hold on these territories was beginning to weaken. The Habsburgs, aided by a growing network of alliances with other European powers, began to challenge Ottoman control, and the two empires would clash again and again in the decades that followed. The Ottoman Empire was also beginning to face challenges from within its borders. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to manage such a vast and diverse territory. The Ottoman system of governance, which had been highly effective in the early years of the empire, was beginning to show signs of strain. Corruption became widespread in the imperial bureaucracy, and local leaders, or pashas, began to assert more control over their territories, often disregarding the authority of the sultan. In addition, the empire's military, once the envy of Europe, began to stagnate. While the Ottomans still maintained a formidable army, it was no longer the well-oiled machine it had been during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. One of the key moments in this period of decline was the Long War, which lasted from 1593 to 1606. This was a protracted and costly conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy, which sought to reclaim territories in Hungary that had been under Ottoman control since the 16th century. The war ended in a stalemate, with neither side gaining a decisive victory. However, the war marked the beginning of a series of military setbacks for the Ottomans, and it exposed the weaknesses of their military and administrative systems. The Treaty of Zitvatoruk, signed in 1606, ended the war but also marked a shift in the balance of power in Europe. The Ottomans were no longer able to dominate the region in the same way they had in the past, and their influence began to wane. Despite the challenges of the early 17th century, the Ottomans were still able to maintain control of vast territories. They continued to rule over much of the Balkans, Anatolia, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of North Africa. But as the century wore on, the empire's ability to govern these vast territories became more and more difficult. The decentralization of power, the increasing corruption within the imperial bureaucracy, and the growing influence of local rulers all contributed to the empire's decline. The Ottoman economy, which had once been one of the most prosperous in the world, also began to suffer. The empire's trade routes, once vital to its economy, were now being bypassed by new maritime routes discovered by European explorers. The rise of European colonial powers, particularly Spain, Portugal, and later Britain and the Netherlands, further undermined Ottoman economic dominance. The next major challenge for the Ottomans came in the form of the rise of the Russian Empire. Russia had been a growing power in Eastern Europe for centuries, but by the mid-17th century, it had become a serious threat to Ottoman interests in the Black Sea and the Caucasus. The Russians began to push southward, challenging Ottoman control over the strategically important region of Crimea. In 1667, the Ottomans were forced to sign the Treaty of Andrasovo, which ceded part of Ukraine to Russia. This was a significant blow to the Ottomans, who had long considered the Black Sea region to be under their control. The Russians, emboldened by this victory, continued to expand their influence in the region, further weakening the Ottoman position. Meanwhile, in the West, the Habsburgs were continuing to challenge Ottoman control over Hungary and the Balkans. In 1683, the Ottomans suffered one of their most significant defeats in the Battle of Vienna. This battle marked the end of the Ottoman attempt to expand into Central Europe, and began a period of slow retreat from the region. The defeat at Vienna was a turning point in Ottoman history. It marked the beginning of the empire's decline as a dominant power in Europe, and the start of a long period of military and territorial losses. The decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century was not just a result of external pressures. Internal problems, such as the weakening of the central government, the increasing power of local rulers, and the decay of the military, all contributed to the empire's troubles. The sultans, who had once been the supreme authority in the empire, were increasingly powerless in the face of these challenges. The empire's once great military, which had been the envy of Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. The Janissaries, once a loyal and disciplined force, had become a politically powerful and often corrupt institution that frequently interfered in the empire's governance. By the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the mighty force it had once been. It still controlled vast territories, but its ability to exert power and influence was in decline. The empire's once unified system of governance was now a patchwork of semi-independent provinces, each with its own local rulers. The Ottoman military, once a formidable force, was now hampered by corruption, inefficiency, and the growing power of the Janissaries. And the Ottoman economy, once one of the most prosperous in the world, was now struggling in the face of new European trade routes and the rise of colonial powers. The 17th century was a period of slow decline for the Ottoman Empire, but it was not the end. Despite the challenges they faced, the Ottomans would continue to exist as a major power for centuries to come. The empire's legacy, marked by its incredible cultural achievements, military prowess, and ability to govern such a vast and diverse empire, would remain an important part of world history. Yet, as the 18th century approached, the empire would find itself at a crossroads, and its ability to maintain its position as a global power would be tested like never before. The 18th century was a time of crisis for the Ottoman Empire. The glorious days of military conquest and cultural flourishing had long since passed, and by the turn of the century, the empire was plagued by both internal strife and external threats. The early 1700s saw the Ottomans still holding on to much of their vast territory, but their control over it had begun to erode. The empire's central authority, once strong and unified, was now fractured, and the once unified Ottoman military was a mere shadow of its former self. Internal corruption, administrative decay, and the decline of the Janissaries were just some of the factors that led to the empire's slow unraveling. In this chapter we will see how the Ottomans faced a series of defeats and lost territories, and how the empire, though still formidable in many ways, began a long and painful journey toward collapse. The first major blow to the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century came in 1683, with the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Vienna. After years of military expansion into Central Europe, the Ottomans sought to capture Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire. In July of that year, the Ottoman army, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, laid siege to the city, hoping to break through its walls and end Habsburg control over Central Europe. However, the siege failed. A combined force of European powers, including the Habsburgs, the Poles, and the Venetians, rallied to the defense of Vienna, and on September 12, 1683, they decisively defeated the Ottoman forces in what would become known as the Battle of Vienna. The loss marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe, and the beginning of a slow but steady retreat. The aftermath of the battle was significant. The Ottomans were forced to sign the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which resulted in the loss of much of their European territory. The empire ceded Hungary, Transylvania, and large parts of the Balkans to the Habsburgs, while Venice gained control of parts of Dalmatia and Morea. This treaty marked the first time in centuries that the Ottomans had been forced to concede such large tracts of land to European powers. It also signaled a shift in the balance of power in Europe, as the Ottomans, once a dominant force on the continent, began their long and gradual retreat from the European stage. Over the next few decades, the Ottoman Empire would struggle to regain its former strength. While the empire remained a major power in the Middle East and North Africa, its influence in Europe continued to decline. The empire's military, once the envy of Europe, was now riddled with inefficiency and corruption. The Janissaries, who had once been a disciplined and loyal fighting force, had become an increasingly powerful and politically active faction within the empire. The Janissaries resisted reforms, and their political influence further destabilized the empire. This was evident during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, 7th city of the 1730, when attempts to modernize the military and restore Ottoman power were met with resistance from the Janissaries. In 1730 the Janissaries staged a coup, forcing Sultan Ahmed III to abdicate and leading to the rise of his successor, Mahmud I, who struggled to restore order and stability to the empire. The 18th century also saw the rise of the Russian Empire as a major power in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Russians began to challenge Ottoman control over the Black Sea and the Caucasus, as well as their influence in Eastern Europe. In 1700, Russia engaged in the Great Northern War with Sweden, and by the end of the conflict in 1721, Russia had emerged as the dominant power in the region. The Ottomans found themselves increasingly challenged by the Russian military, and in the decades that followed, the two empires would become bitter rivals. In 1768 the Ottoman Empire and Russia went to war once again, this time over the fate of the Crimean Khanate, a region that had been under Ottoman suzerainty. The resulting conflict, known as the Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774, ended in a humiliating defeat for the Ottomans. The Treaty of Küçükçaynak, signed in 1774, forced the Ottomans to cede large parts of the Black Sea region to Russia and grant the Crimean Khanate full independence. The treaty also allowed Russia to intervene in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire, giving the Russians significant influence over the fate of the empire. This marked a turning point in the Ottoman-Russian relationship, and Russia's growing influence in the Black Sea and the Balkans would continue to be a major factor in the empire's decline. By the late 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. While it still controlled vast territories in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans, it had lost much of its power and influence. The once mighty Ottoman military had become ineffective, and the empire was no longer able to assert its authority over its provinces. The central government, once the heart of the empire, had grown increasingly weak and corrupt, and local rulers, or pashas, had gained greater autonomy. The empire's economic system was in disarray, and the Ottomans struggled to keep up with the technological advancements and economic changes taking place in Europe. The early 19th century saw the Ottoman Empire continue to struggle to maintain its grip on power. In 1804, a major rebellion broke out in the Balkans, led by Serbs seeking independence from Ottoman rule. The rebellion was just one of many nationalist uprisings that would plague the empire in the coming decades. The rise of nationalism in Europe, combined with the weakening of Ottoman authority, led to widespread unrest in the empire's provinces. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, was another sign of the empire's fragility. The Greeks, with the support of European powers such as Britain and France, rose up against Ottoman rule, and by 1827, the Ottomans had been forced to grant Greece independence. As the Ottomans were losing ground to nationalist movements, the empire was also facing external pressure from European powers. The 19th century saw the rise of European imperialism, and the Ottomans found themselves increasingly caught between the competing interests of the major European powers. The British, French, and Russians all had their eyes on Ottoman territories, and the empire was often forced to make concessions to maintain its survival. The British in particular sought to maintain control over Egypt and the Suez Canal, while the Russians pushed to expand their influence in the Black Sea and the Caucasus. Despite these challenges, the Ottoman Empire continued to exist well into the 19th century. But it was no longer the powerful, expansive empire it had once been. The empire's decline was evident in its inability to maintain control over its provinces, its weakening military, and its inability to modernize in the face of European technological advancements. By the early 19th century, the Ottomans had become what many referred to as the sick man of Europe, a term that reflected the empire's crumbling state and the growing belief that its days were numbered. The 18th and early 19th centuries were marked by a series of defeats, territorial losses and internal problems that ultimately led to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-19th century, the Ottomans would find themselves embroiled in a series of reforms aimed at preserving the empire, but the damage had already been done. The empire's decline would continue through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th as it faced the challenges of modernization, nationalism, and the pressures of European imperialism. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was at a crossroads. The once powerful and far-reaching empire, which had controlled vast swaths of Europe, Asia, and Africa, was now beset by a multitude of internal and external crises. The empire's territorial losses, military setbacks, and declining economy had left it weak, and the increasing influence of European powers only added to its struggles. Nationalist movements were rising within the empire's borders, and its subjects, who had long been tied together under the banner of the Ottoman Sultan, were now asserting their own national identities and desires for independence. In response to these challenges, the Ottomans attempted a series of ambitious reforms, known as the Tanzimat, aimed at modernizing the empire and preserving its unity. But despite these efforts, the empire's decline would continue, and the Tanzimat period would become both a symbol of hope for reform and a painful reminder of the empire's inability to cope with the forces of nationalism and modernity. The Tanzimat reforms began in the 1830s, during the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, who recognized that the empire's military and administrative systems were in desperate need of modernization. In many ways, Mahmud II had already begun a series of reforms before the Tanzimat era officially began, including the dismantling of the Janissary Corps in 1826. The Janissaries had long been a powerful political force, but they had become a major obstacle to the Sultan's efforts to modernize the military. In the infamous auspicious incident of 1826, Mahmud II ordered the mass execution of the Janissaries, effectively eliminating this once powerful institution. This act, while brutal, paved the way for the establishment of a new modernized army that could better defend the empire from external and internal threats. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud II focused on further reforms aimed at strengthening the Ottoman state. His vision of a centralized, modernized empire was clear, but it would take several more decades for these ideas to be fully realized. The Tanzimat period officially began in 1839, after the death of Mahmud II, when Sultan Abdülmecid I ascended the throne. Abdülmecid I, influenced by European ideas of governance and law, sought to enact sweeping reforms to modernize the empire's institutions, military, and economy. The first of these reforms came in the form of the Gülhane Edict, issued in 1839, which promised a series of changes aimed at creating a more equal and just society. The edict promised security of life, property, and honor for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of their religion or ethnicity, and it outlined a series of legal and administrative reforms to create a more centralized government. The Tanzimat reforms, however, were not limited to just the legal and military spheres. One of the most significant aspects of the period was the attempt to modernize the Ottoman economy. The empire had long been reliant on agricultural production, but the rise of industrialization in Europe had made clear the need for new economic policies. Sultan Abdülmecid I and his successors sought to build a more modern economy by encouraging the development of infrastructure, including railroads, roads, and factories. They also sought to modernize the financial system by creating new banks, introducing a new currency, and seeking loans from European powers. These reforms were meant to stimulate the economy and ensure the empire's survival in a world that was rapidly changing. The Tanzimat period also saw the establishment of new educational institutions. The Ottomans sought to emulate the Western model of education, and new schools were established to train a new generation of bureaucrats, military officers, and professionals. The Mektebi Harbiye Military Academy was established in 1834, and the Mektebi Tibbiye medical school followed shortly afterward. These institutions were designed to produce educated citizens who could help modernize the empire's military and administrative systems. The Ottoman government also attempted to introduce secularism into education, challenging the traditional religious schools that had long dominated the Ottoman educational system. While these reforms were ambitious, they were not always successful, and the empire's education system remained uneven and fragmented. Despite these efforts to modernize, the Tanzimat reforms faced significant challenges. One of the biggest obstacles to reform was the deeply entrenched nature of Ottoman society. The empire had long been governed by a complex system of patronage, where local rulers and elites held significant power. Many of these elites resisted the centralizing reforms of the Tanzimat, fearing they would lose their influence and wealth. The religious establishment, too, was wary of the Tanzimat reforms, which sought to secularize many aspects of Ottoman life. Religious leaders, particularly the ulama, a powerful class of scholars and clerics, opposed the Tanzimat's attempts to reduce their influence and challenge traditional Ottoman social norms. The rise of nationalism within the Ottoman Empire also complicated the reform process. By the 19th century, many of the empire's subjects were no longer content to identify solely as Ottomans. Nationalism, a powerful force in Europe, began to spread within the empire's borders. Various ethnic and religious groups, including Greeks, Serbs, Armenians, and Arabs, began to demand greater autonomy or outright independence. The first major nationalist movement within the empire was the Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821 and resulted in the establishment of the independent Greek state in 1830. The Greek uprising was a sign of things to come, and other ethnic groups within the empire would soon follow suit, calling for similar rights and independence. Nationalism among the empire's Christian subjects was particularly strong, as many of these groups had been influenced by the growing nationalist movements in Europe. The Serbs, who had long been under Ottoman rule, began to demand independence in the early 19th century. The Serbian Revolution, which began in 1804, was a significant event in the Ottoman Balkans, and eventually led to the establishment of the modern Serbian state. Similarly, the Bulgarians, Romanians, and Albanians began to assert their national identities, and by the second half of the 19th century, nationalist movements were spreading across the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire's inability to cope with these nationalist demands weakened its control over the Balkans, and would eventually lead to the loss of many of its European territories. In addition to the nationalist movements, the Ottoman Empire faced growing pressures from European powers. The rise of the European imperialist powers in the 19th century meant that the Ottomans were increasingly caught in a web of European diplomacy and conflict. The British, French, and Russians were all eager to expand their influence in the Middle East and the Balkans, and they often intervened in Ottoman affairs. The Crimean War 1853–1856, which pitted the Ottoman Empire against Russia, is a prime example of this European involvement. The Ottomans, aided by Britain and France, were able to defeat Russia in the conflict, but it was clear that the empire's days of independence were numbered. The war further exposed the empire's military weaknesses and its dependence on European powers for support. As the Tanzimat reforms continued throughout the 1840s and 1850s, it became increasingly clear that the empire's central authority was crumbling. Local rulers and elites were growing more powerful, and nationalist movements were gaining ground. The Tanzimat, despite its ambitious goals, failed to achieve the sweeping modernization and centralization that the empire so desperately needed. Instead, the reforms often exacerbated the empire's problems, as the attempt to impose a centralized system of governance conflicted with the empire's deeply decentralized structure. The Young Ottomans, a group of reformers in the 1860s and 1870s, would later attempt to push for further changes, but the Tanzimat period had already marked the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Despite the Tanzimat reforms and efforts to modernize, the empire's ability to cope with internal and external pressures was rapidly diminishing. Nationalism, European imperialism, and internal dissent were eroding the empire's power and unity. The empire, once a mighty force, had become an increasingly fragile entity, struggling to maintain its grip on power as the world around it changed rapidly. The Tanzimat reforms, while significant in many ways, ultimately highlighted the deep contradictions within the Ottoman system, and the empire would continue its slow decline throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a critical period in the history of the Ottoman Empire. Despite attempts at reform and modernization, the empire found itself on the brink of collapse. Nationalism continued to rise within its borders, and the empire's ability to maintain control over its vast and diverse territories began to erode. The European powers, especially Britain, France, and Russia, had long been eyeing the Ottoman lands, and the empire found itself trapped between the competing interests of these imperial powers. Throughout this period, the Ottomans experienced a series of military defeats, territorial losses, and internal uprisings that would eventually lead to the empire's dissolution. This chapter examines the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on the political, military, and social factors that contributed to its eventual collapse in 1918. The first significant event in this period was the 1876 Ottoman Constitution and the rise of Sultan Abdülhamid II to the throne. Abdülhamid II, who ascended to the throne in 1876, came at a time when the empire was already struggling with its survival. In response to growing discontent and pressures for reform, the Ottomans attempted to introduce a constitutional government in 1876. The constitution, which granted basic civil liberties and created a parliamentary system, was seen as a hopeful step toward modernizing the empire's political system. However, Abdülhamid II's rule took a different turn. After just 2 years of constitutional rule, Abdülhamid II suspended the constitution and dissolved the parliament, opting for an authoritarian approach that would dominate much of his reign. This decision marked the beginning of a period of increasing political repression and centralization under Abdülhamid II. Abdülhamid II was determined to maintain the empire's power and unity, but his methods were often brutal. He relied heavily on surveillance, censorship, and repression to control opposition. The Athemedian regime was known for its authoritarianism, and Abdülhamid II's focus on centralized control often led to violent crackdowns on dissent. Among his most notorious actions was his suppression of the Armenian population, culminating in the Armenian massacres of 1894-1896, where thousands of Armenians were killed by Ottoman forces. The mass killings were a sign of the increasing ethnic tensions within the empire, and the Armenian question would remain a significant issue in the years to come. While Abdülhamid II's reign was marked by political repression, it also saw some efforts to modernize the empire's infrastructure. During his rule, railroads were expanded, telegraph lines were laid, and new schools were established. The most famous of these projects was the construction of the Hejaz Railway, which connected Istanbul with the holy city of Mecca. The railway was an important symbol of Ottoman ambition to modernize and to maintain control over the Arab provinces. However, these modernizing efforts were not enough to offset the deep-rooted problems facing the empire. Despite these infrastructural developments, the Ottoman economy remained weak, and its military was still far behind the European powers in terms of technology and organization. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire continued to face the growing challenge of nationalism. The Balkans in particular were becoming increasingly volatile. In the 1870s, a series of wars erupted in the region, culminating in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, which ended in defeat for the Ottomans. As a result of the war, the empire lost significant territories in the Balkans, including Bulgaria and Bosnia-Herzegovina, which were both awarded independence or placed under foreign control. The The defeat further undermined the Ottoman position in Europe and emboldened nationalist movements within the empire. The Treaty of Berlin in 1878 further partitioned Ottoman territories and marked the beginning of the empire's retreat from Europe. At the same time, nationalism was not only a problem in the Balkans, it was also spreading among the empire's Arab subjects. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Arabs began to push for greater autonomy from Ottoman rule. The rise of Arab nationalism was closely linked to the broader process of decolonization and the increasing influence of European powers in the Middle East. The Ottomans tried to maintain control over their Arab provinces, but the weakening of central authority and the rise of nationalist movements made it more difficult to govern. The Arab Revolt, which would take place in the early 20th century, was a direct result of these tensions, but it was not the only challenge the Ottomans faced. Internally, the empire was also struggling with economic difficulties. The Ottoman economy was heavily dependent on agriculture, but it was also deeply indebted to European powers. In the late 19th century, the Ottomans began borrowing large sums of money from European banks, which in turn led to the empire becoming economically subjugated to foreign powers. At the turn of the century, the empire was deeply in debt, and its ability to manage its finances had become a significant issue. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, established in 1881, gave European creditors significant control over the empire's finances. This economic subjugation further weakened the Ottomans and undermined their ability to maintain power over their subjects. The early 20th century brought even more challenges for the Ottoman Empire. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 was a turning point in the empire's history. The group of reform-minded military officers, intellectuals and bureaucrats, known as the Young Turks, sought to restore the constitution and parliamentary system that had been suspended by Abdul Hamid II. They hoped to modernize the empire and create a more representative government. The revolution was successful in ousting Abdul Hamid II and forcing him to reinstate the constitution. The Young Turks, under the leadership of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Ijamal Pasha, quickly took control of the government and began implementing a series of reforms. However, the Young Turk regime was soon embroiled in its own set of problems. The empire's position in the world continued to deteriorate, and the Young Turks found themselves struggling to maintain control over the empire's increasingly fragmented territories. The Balkan Wars of 1912–1913 saw the loss of almost all of the empire's European holdings, and the Ottoman Empire was further weakened by the war's aftermath. The empire's defeat in the Balkan Wars marked the end of Ottoman control in Europe and solidified the empire's status as the sick man of Europe. As the empire's situation grew more desperate, the Young Turks increasingly turned to the military for support. The empire's participation in World War I was a desperate attempt to regain lost territory and influence, but it ultimately proved to be the final blow for the Ottomans. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping to gain European support and regain some of their lost territories. However, the war ended in defeat for the Central Powers, and the Ottoman Empire found itself on the losing side. The empire's territories were divided up by the victorious Allies, and the empire itself was dismantled under the terms of the Treaty of Savoy in 1920. The treaty, which was never ratified, called for the complete disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. The final blow to the Ottoman Empire came with the Turkish War of Independence, 1919–1923, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Atatürk and his followers sought to create a new independent Turkish republic out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne officially recognized the new Republic of Turkey, marking the official end of the Ottoman Empire. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1923 brought to an end over 600 years of Ottoman rule and began a new chapter in the history of Turkey and the Middle East. The fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1923 marked the end of an era. The empire, which had spanned over 6 centuries, was no longer a significant player in the world order. The signing of the Treaty of Sevres in 1920 and the subsequent establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk symbolized the formal end of the Ottoman legacy. However, the consequences of the empire's collapse reverberated long after its fall, not only in the territories that once belonged to the Ottomans, but also in the global geopolitics of the 20th century. This chapter explores the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's demise, focusing on the new political realities that emerged in its former territories, the legacy left behind by the Ottomans, and how the collapse of the empire shaped the world in the years that followed. The Ottoman Empire's demise in 1918 was a direct consequence of its involvement in World War I. Having sided with the Central Powers, the Ottomans hoped to reverse the tide of decline and regain some of their former glory. However, the outcome of the war spelled disaster for the empire. The signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918 marked the end of hostilities between the Ottoman Empire and the Allied powers. The terms of the armistice effectively left the Ottomans defeated and crippled. The empire was subjected to Allied occupation and partition, its fate sealed by the post-war treaties that sought to redraw the map of the Middle East and the Balkans. Under the terms of the Treaty of Sevres signed in 1920, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered and its territories were divided among the victorious Allied powers. The empire's Arab provinces were carved up into mandates administered by Britain and France, leading to the creation of countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. The Ottoman heartland of Anatolia was left to a weakened and fragmented Ottoman state. The Ottoman Empire's capital, Istanbul, was placed under occupation by Allied forces, and the Sultanate was left with little power to maintain control over its remaining lands. The Treaty of Sevres marked the end of the Ottoman Empire, but the war was far from over for the region. As the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the people of Anatolia, many of whom had long been subjects of the sultans, found themselves in a state of uncertainty. The Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was a response to the foreign occupation and the Ottoman state's incapacity to govern. Atatürk, a former Ottoman military officer, emerged as the leader of the nationalist movement, rallying Turks to resist both the foreign occupation and the disintegration of their homeland. The Turkish War of Independence was marked by intense battles between Atatürk's forces and both the Allied occupation forces and Greek and Armenian militias, who had seized parts of the Ottoman Empire's former territories. The war ultimately resulted in the defeat of the occupying forces and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, marking the official end of the Ottoman Empire. The formation of the Republic of Turkey was a turning point not only for the Turkish people but also for the entire region. Atatürk and his followers sought to build a modern, secular and nationalistic state, casting aside the old Ottoman institutions and traditions. The abolition of the Sultanate in 1922 and the subsequent establishment of a republic in 1923 marked the symbolic end of the Ottoman dynasty, and Atatürk became the first president of the new republic. His leadership would go on to shape Turkey into a modern nation-state and set the stage for the country's future political and social development. One of Atatürk's first and most significant acts was the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. The Caliphate had been the central institution of the Ottoman Empire's religious authority, and its abolition marked a radical break from the past. The move was part of Atatürk's larger effort to modernize Turkey and establish a secular government that would not be beholden to religious institutions. Atatürk introduced sweeping reforms, including the adoption of a new alphabet, the promotion of Western-style education, and the establishment of a secular legal system. These reforms were designed to create a new identity for Turkey that was distinct from its Ottoman past and aligned with the modern world. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire also had profound effects on the regions that had once been part of the empire. In the Arab world, the defeat of the Ottomans led to the rise of new nationalist movements. The dismemberment of the empire and the imposition of European mandates created artificial borders that ignored ethnic and religious divisions. This led to ongoing conflicts and tensions in the Middle East, as countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon struggled to define their national identities and navigate the complexities of their colonial legacies. The Ottoman legacy in the Arab world was a mixed one. While the Ottomans had introduced a measure of stability and cohesion, their rule had also been marked by repression and exploitation. The rise of nationalist movements in the Arab world, many of which had been inspired by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, would go on to shape the region's politics in the 20th century. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire also lingered in the Balkans. The Balkan Wars of the early 20th century had already stripped the Ottomans of most of their European territories, but the remnants of Ottoman influence persisted in the region. The newly independent Balkan states, such as Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, had mixed feelings about their Ottoman past. Some saw the Ottoman era as a period of oppression, while others looked back on it as a time of relative stability. The legacy of Ottoman rule in the Balkans was complex, and it continued to influence the region's politics long after the empire's collapse. The Ottoman Empire's legacy was also felt in the Eastern Mediterranean. The fall of the Ottomans led to the decline of their once vibrant trade networks, which had connected the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe for centuries. The shift in political and economic power toward European imperialism during the 19th century had already weakened the Ottoman economy, but the empire's collapse further disrupted the flow of goods and services across the region. The establishment of the Republic of Turkey, however, marked the beginning of a new phase in the region's history, as Ataturk's vision for a modern, independent Turkey helped to redefine the political and economic landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Ottoman Empire was its cultural influence. The Ottomans had created a rich and diverse civilization that spanned 3 continents. Their architecture, art, literature, and cuisine continue to influence the countries that were once part of the empire. The Ottoman architectural style, characterized by its grand mosques, palaces, and bridges, can still be seen throughout Turkey and the former Ottoman territories. The Ottoman culinary tradition has also left its mark on the Middle East and the Balkans, with dishes like kebabs, baklava, and pilaf becoming staples in many countries. The Ottomans also contributed to the development of classical music, calligraphy, and other forms of artistic expression. Their cultural influence is still felt today, and the Ottoman legacy remains an integral part of the history and identity of the countries that once fell under their rule. The Ottoman Empire, in the end, was a civilization that spanned centuries, continents, and cultures. Its rise and fall had a profound impact on the course of world history, shaping the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of the regions it once controlled. While the empire's collapse in 1923 marked the end of its political influence, the legacy of the Ottomans continues to resonate today, as the former Ottoman lands continue to navigate the complexities of their shared history. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not just the story of a fading empire, but also the story of a vibrant and diverse civilization that left an indelible mark on the world. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1923 was a defining moment in history. It was not just the end of a political entity that had spanned over 6 centuries, but the beginning of a new era for the territories that once formed part of the empire. With the establishment of the Republic of Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a new nation-state emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, determined to create a modern and secular republic. But the Ottoman Empire, though gone, was far from forgotten. Its impact still resonates in the politics, culture, and identities of the regions it once controlled. This chapter examines how the legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to shape the modern world, and how its reflections are still evident in the present-day countries that once belonged to it. The most significant legacy of the Ottoman Empire lies in the very countries that emerged from its collapse. The Republic of Turkey, the successor state to the Ottomans, has undergone a transformation since its founding in 1923. Ataturk's radical reforms, which included secularization, modernization, and nationalization, established a new identity for Turkey that was separate from its Ottoman past. The Turkish Republic sought to embrace the values of Western-style democracy, industry, and secularism. This shift was symbolized in many ways, from the replacement of the Ottoman Arabic script with the Latin alphabet to the adoption of new laws that separated religion from the state. Ataturk's vision for Turkey was that it should stand firmly in the modern world, free from the perceived backwardness of the Ottoman Empire. Yet despite these radical changes, the Ottoman legacy remains an integral part of Turkish identity. In Turkey, the memory of the Ottoman Empire is complex and multifaceted. While Ataturk's reforms emphasized a break from the past, the Ottoman Empire is still celebrated in many cultural and national narratives. Turkish society continues to take pride in the Ottoman achievements, particularly in the realms of architecture, art and cuisine. Istanbul, once the capital of the Ottoman Empire, is now the cultural heart of Turkey, where Ottoman mosques, palaces and bazaars still attract millions of visitors each year. The architectural style of the Ottomans continues to influence modern Turkish building design, with grand mosques and government buildings reflecting a fusion of Ottoman and modern aesthetics. Turkish cuisine, heavily influenced by the Ottomans, remains a staple of daily life in the country, with dishes such as kebabs, baklava and meze being enjoyed in homes and restaurants alike. However, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire is not without its challenges. In Turkey, as in other former Ottoman territories, there are ongoing debates about how much of the Ottoman past should be embraced in modern identity. The Ottoman Empire was, after all, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, and its collapse left behind complex questions about national identity and the relationship between religion and state. The secular nature of the Turkish Republic, while a cornerstone of Ataturk's vision, has been increasingly questioned in recent years, especially under the leadership of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has promoted a more Islamic-oriented agenda. This has led to a re-evaluation of Turkey's Ottoman past, with some seeing it as a source of national pride, while others view it as an obstacle to the country's secular modernity. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire is also felt in the Middle East and the Balkans, regions that were once integral parts of the empire. In the Arab world, the collapse of the Ottomans left behind a patchwork of states that were often artificially created by the European powers. The borders drawn by the British and French in the aftermath of World War I, most notably under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, ignored the complex ethnic, religious and tribal divisions that existed in the region. The Ottoman Empire had, despite its many flaws, provided a sense of unity in the region. After its fall, Arab nationalism began to emerge as a powerful force, driven by a desire for independence and self-determination. However, the legacies of Ottoman rule, both the good and the bad, remain deeply embedded in the region's politics and culture. The impact of Ottoman rule in the Arab world is still evident today. Many Arab countries retain deep cultural ties to their Ottoman past, with the influence of Ottoman architecture, music and literature still present in cities like Damascus, Cairo and Beirut. The Ottoman legacy also continues to shape the political structures of the region. For example, many Arab countries retain a legacy of centralized rule and bureaucratic governance that dates back to the Ottoman system. Furthermore, the Ottoman Empire's role as the protector of Sunni Islam in the region still influences the religious and political dynamics in the Middle East. The collapse of the empire and the subsequent fragmentation of the Arab world, coupled with the rise of nationalism, has led to the development of new political identities, but the Ottoman past remains a powerful force in shaping the region's present. In the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire's influence is similarly significant. The region, which was under Ottoman control for centuries, is still marked by the legacy of Ottoman rule. The Ottomans left behind a rich cultural heritage, including mosques, bridges, and palaces that still stand as symbols of their presence in the region. At the same time, Ottoman rule in the Balkans is often viewed with ambivalence, as the empire's influence was not always welcomed by the Christian populations of the region. The fall of the Ottomans and the emergence of independent Balkan states led to the establishment of new national identities, often defined in opposition to the Ottoman legacy. However, the shared history of Ottoman rule continues to be a source of both pride and resentment in the region, and it remains a significant part of the cultural fabric of the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire's legacy also extends to the global stage. The empire played a key role in the geopolitics of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and its collapse had a ripple effect that reshaped the world order. The division of Ottoman lands after World War I and the rise of nationalist movements in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans were directly influenced by the empire's fall. The borders drawn by the European powers in the wake of the Ottoman collapse remain a source of tension and conflict in the Middle East and Africa to this day. The Ottoman Empire's collapse also marked the beginning of the decline of traditional empires and the rise of new forms of nation-state sovereignty. The global legacy of the Ottoman Empire is intertwined with the broader history of imperialism, decolonization, and the reshaping of national identities. The Ottoman Empire also left a lasting imprint on global culture and civilization. The empire's rich cultural heritage, which spanned continents, included contributions to art, literature, music, and science. Ottoman architecture, particularly the iconic mosques and palaces, has influenced architectural styles in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Ottoman literature, poetry, and music continue to be studied and appreciated by scholars and enthusiasts alike. The empire's contributions to art, calligraphy, and science helped shape the intellectual and cultural climate of the Middle East and Europe. Even today, the Ottoman legacy is evident in many aspects of global culture, from the foods we eat to the art we admire. As we look to the future, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to shape the political, cultural, and social landscapes of the regions it once controlled. The Ottoman legacy remains a topic of debate and reflection in Turkey and beyond, as people continue to grapple with the complexities of their shared past. For some, the Ottoman Empire represents a glorious period of prosperity, tolerance, and cultural achievement. For others, it is a symbol of imperial domination, conflict, and division. The Ottoman Empire, though gone, has left an indelible mark on the world, and its legacy continues to be felt today, shaping the identities, politics, and cultures of the countries that once were part of it. The story of the Ottoman Empire is one of immense scope, spanning over 6 centuries and leaving an indelible mark on the world. It begins in the late 13th century, when a small Turkish principality, led by the ambitious Osman I, founded a state on the fringes of the Byzantine Empire. This seemingly modest beginning would evolve into one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. Over the next several centuries, the Ottoman Empire would rise to dominate vast swathes of land across 3 continents, touching Europe, Asia, and Africa. The story of the Ottomans is one of remarkable triumphs, complicated relationships, and ultimately, a slow but inevitable decline, ending in 1923 with the creation of the Republic of Turkey. The foundation of the empire, 1299–1453. The tale begins in 1299, with Osman I founding the Ottoman dynasty. Osman's small principality in Anatolia started as a small frontier state amidst the remains of the Seljuk Sultanate, with the Byzantine Empire lingering to the west. Osman, driven by ambition and a keen strategic mind, forged alliances with local Turkish tribes and made several successful raids into Byzantine territories. This period marked the beginning of a long tradition of military conquest, where the Ottomans would gain a reputation as fierce warriors. However, it wasn't just military prowess that would propel the Ottomans to greatness. Under Osman's successors, the Ottomans began to develop a unique social and political system. One of the key elements of the empire's expansion was the use of janissaries, elite soldiers drawn from Christian communities through the devshirme system. These soldiers were converted to Islam, trained rigorously, and became a formidable fighting force that helped expand the empire's reach. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had begun to seriously threaten the Byzantine Empire, which was already weakened by centuries of decline. In 1453, Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, achieved one of the most famous victories in history, the capture of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and solidified the Ottomans as a major power in both Europe and the Middle East. Mehmed's conquest was not just military though, it was also cultural. By converting the Hagia Sophia into a mosque and transforming the city into the new capital of the empire, Mehmed established Istanbul as a center of art, culture and learning that would thrive for centuries. The height of Ottoman power, 16th–17th century. The 16th century was the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its zenith. Suleiman was not just a military leader, but a statesman, a lawgiver, and a patron of the arts. His reign saw the empire expand its territory to its largest extent, stretching from the Persian Gulf in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and from the Balkans in the north to North Africa in the south. The Ottomans were at the height of their power, controlling key trade routes and enjoying immense wealth and influence. Suleiman's reign is also notable for his legal reforms. Known as the lawgiver, Suleiman reformed the Ottoman legal system, balancing traditional Islamic law with the needs of his increasingly diverse empire. His legal code helped solidify the empire's internal coherence and provided a model for future rulers. During this period, the Ottomans also expanded their cultural influence, with Ottoman architecture becoming synonymous with grandeur. The Ottomans built stunning mosques, palaces, and bridges, many of which, like the Suleymaniye Mosque, remain iconic symbols of the empire's artistic legacy. However, as the 17th century dawned, the empire began to experience the early signs of strain. While the Ottomans still controlled vast territories, the military and political systems began to falter. The once mighty Janissaries became more of a burden than a benefit, often meddling in political affairs. The empire's vast size made it difficult to govern effectively, and corruption began to seep into the administration. The military, once the backbone of the empire, began to lose its edge as new powers in Europe, like the Habsburgs and the Russian Empire, began to challenge Ottoman dominance. The long decline, 18th–19th century. The decline of the Ottoman Empire was slow but steady. By the 18th century, the empire had lost much of its military might. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was a significant naval defeat for the Ottomans, and the empire's territorial holdings in Europe, such as Hungary and parts of the Balkans, began to shrink. Additionally, the empire's internal problems, including inefficient taxation systems and weak leadership, began to take a toll. The empire's position as the dominant power in the region was slowly undermined by European rivals, who were rapidly advancing in industrialization and military technology. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. European powers, sensing the empire's weakness, began to carve up Ottoman territory through a series of wars and treaties. The Crimean War 1853–1856 was one such conflict, where Russia sought to expand its influence in the Black Sea region. Meanwhile, nationalist movements within the empire's various ethnic and religious groups began to demand autonomy or independence, further fragmenting Ottoman control. The Greek War of Independence, 1821–1830, and the rise of nationalism in the Balkans were just the beginning of a series of revolutions that would shake the empire's foundations. The Young Turks movement in the late 19th century, which sought to modernize the empire and restore its former glory, marked another pivotal moment, though it ultimately failed to reverse the empire's decline. The loss of territory in the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East was compounded by the empire's inability to modernize its military and economy. European powers, particularly Britain and France, took advantage of the Ottomans' weakness, forcing them to sign a series of unequal treaties that eroded Ottoman sovereignty. The empire's once thriving cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Istanbul became shadows of their former selves, struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing world. World War I and the empire's final days, 1914–1923. The Ottoman Empire's involvement in World War I would be its final and most catastrophic chapter. Entering the war on the side of the Central Powers, the Ottomans hoped to regain some of their lost territories and influence. However, the war ended in disaster for the empire. The Ottomans suffered heavy defeats, and by 1918 their forces had been driven from nearly all of their territories. The Treaty of Sevres in 1920 formalized the empire's collapse, dividing its lands among the Allied powers and granting independence to many of its former provinces. Istanbul was occupied by Allied forces, and the Ottoman Sultanate was left powerless. But the fall of the Ottoman Empire did not signal the end of Turkish sovereignty. In the midst of the post-war chaos, a nationalist movement, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, rose to challenge the Ottoman government's impotence. Atatürk's Turkish War of Independence, 1919–1922, was a fight not just against foreign occupation but also against the old Ottoman order itself. The nationalist forces defeated the occupying Allied forces and their local collaborators, eventually founding the Republic of Turkey in 1923. The abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922 marked the final end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman legacy, 1923–present. Even though the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist in 1923, its legacy is still deeply embedded in the modern world. The Republic of Turkey, under Atatürk's leadership, aimed to break with the Ottoman past and create a secular, modern state. Atatürk introduced sweeping reforms including the abolition of the caliphate, the introduction of a new alphabet, and the promotion of secularism in government. However, the cultural legacy of the Ottomans, particularly in art, architecture, and cuisine, continues to thrive in Turkey and the wider Middle East. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire's division of the Middle East has left a profound impact on the geopolitics of the region. The borders drawn by the Allied powers after World War I created new nation-states that were often torn by ethnic and religious divisions, leading to instability and conflict that persists to this day. The Ottoman legacy can also be seen in the political and cultural life of the Balkans and North Africa, where former Ottoman territories continue to grapple with their shared history. The Ottomans' contributions to art, architecture, science and literature also endure, influencing global culture in ways that are still felt. Ottoman mosques, palaces and bridges remain architectural wonders, while the empire's literature, music and cuisine continue to shape the cultural traditions of many countries. Thus, the story of the Ottoman Empire is not just a tale of rise and fall. It is a story of the creation of a world empire that left its mark on countless nations, cultures and peoples. The legacy of the Ottomans is a complex and enduring one, woven into the fabric of the modern world in ways that are both visible and hidden.